That was Joan Sutherland singing the Du Barry with the Ambrosian Light Opera Orchestra. And now it's good afternoon to Jim O'Hagan.
Hello again, Walter. A few of my friends for hobbies write short stories or poems. One in particular has written an unpublished novel. All of them long for the day when their work will be published and reviewed by the literary critics. And yet, none of them, I'm sure, would like the title of World's Worst Writer, which for many our subject today was. She was Amanda McKitterick Ross, a formidable lady, who certainly would not have agreed with that title. Indeed, she boasted that her books would be remembered 1,000 years after her death. Such was her self-confidence in her ability. Certain others, amongst them Asquith the Prime Minister, James Agate, and the distinguished writers Mark Twain and Aldous Huxley, did admire her books. Huxley said she was an Elizabethan ahead of her time. There was even for a time an Amanda McKitterick Ross Appreciation Society in both Oxford and Cambridge universities, and her books in these quarters were much sought after for their amusing writing. Anna McKitterick was born on the 8th of December 1860 in Drummoness, County Down, her father being a school teacher, her mother the former Eliza Black. Amanda trained for teaching at Marlborough Street College, Dublin, in 1884-5, and afterwards taught for some time at Millbrook Primary School, Larne. In 1887 she married a widower, Andy Ross, the station master at Larne, in Joymount Presbyterian Church, Carrickfergus. He was a genial man who met all the important people and got to know many of them, including Lord Randolph Churchill, father of Sir Winston, when they made the sea crossing from Stranraer. Amanda was greatly influenced by two books she had read: The Children of the Abbey by Regina Maria Roach and The Sorrows of Satan by Marie Corelli. She always considered that the latter was the world's best writer. During the 1890s, after she had given up teaching, Amanda commenced serious work on her first novel, Irene Iddlesley, and had it published at her own expense in 1897. She said that she was occupied in writing this novel from her very early girlhood, but this is doubtful. The book is the story of a young woman who marries a much older man. She then runs off with a previous lover and returns destroyed by this relationship. Society shuns her, and she is spurned by her only son. The book did not come to the attention of the public much until 1898, when it was reviewed in the publication Black and White by Barry Payne, who had been sent a copy of it by three young Dublin sisters. Barry Payne criticised the book, as Jack Loudon says, in a heavy-handed, humorous way, as being totally devoid of any meaning, and of having no sense of humour about it. Amanda was devastated by this, and never forgot it for the rest of her life. So incensed was she that she replied to her critic in the preface of her second novel, Delina Delaney, published again by herself a year or so later. Payne, we are told, was delighted by her reaction and started holding what he called Delina Delaney dinners afterwards. As both Amanda's novels were at this time privately published, they became rarities. Members of the Cambridge and Oxford societies passed the books around their members by hand. The Cambridge Society owned only one officially, and some people copied passages in term time so that they could entertain their friends in the vacation. The thing is, Walter, that there is no accounting for literary or most other types of taste, and lots of folk thought the books were amusing. Delina Delaney is a much fuller and more elaborate book than Irene, about double its size. Its theme is class consciousness, where a young lord of the manor falls in love with the daughter of a poor fisherman. They elope, and along the way encounter the sinister Madame de Maine, but all ends well. Jack Loudon, who I have already referred to briefly, wrote a much acclaimed biography of Mrs. Ross, calling it O Rare Amanda. The book was published in 1954, and the second edition appeared in 1969 by Chatto and Windus. Loudon met her a number of times in the 1930s and recalls these experiences as unforgettable, as the title implies. Loudon refers in the biography to the literary style of Amanda. There is strong and indeed overuse of alliteration in her work. An example would be describing someone as a monster of mangled might. She never tries to be amusing. Her purpose is always deadly serious, but despite this ends up being very funny for those who appreciate her. It seems she never herself suspected this quality in her writings. Amanda wasn't a satirist or a moralist, and certain words like white never appear. She uses snowy instead. There are other odd usages as well, like the words north and south and sister. Loudon remarks that at times in her work she disregards sense so that the meaning of particular passages becomes obscure. He puts this down to her burning imagination and being carried away with the intensity of the plots and situations she invents. For him, it's the absurdity of much of her work that makes her so funny. Obviously, not all her critics would agree. Amanda dropped the last S of her name Ross shortly after she wrote Irene, and from then on she styled her surname R.O.S. She also bought Iddlesley, her house in Larne, in part from the proceeds of her first novel. In 1908 she took over the running of a lime kiln at Glenoe, near the town. The owner was a Mr. Crawford, a friend of her husband, who fell ill. When he died, round about 1911, she was left more or less all the property, and it must be said a lot of trouble, for Crawford's nephews disputed the will. Much litigation followed, and eventually Amanda was forced to dispose of the whole undertaking due to financial difficulties. Lawyers she hated, but she was extremely litigious herself. Folklore around Larne has it that she kept at least one solicitor in permanent employment for 10 years, dealing with all the legal battles and tussles she became involved in with a number of people. At one period, 6 firms of solicitors were involved, 3 in Larne, 2 in Belfast and 1 in Dublin. At times she felt victimised by certain lawyers in Larne and took to stopping outside the windows of their respective premises and blowing a toy trumpet at them, or raising a banner in front of these premises. This was, of course, highly amusing to passers-by. She nicknamed one of the men Mickey Monkey Face MacBlear. Amanda was a formidable and familiar sight in Larne in her day. At one time she had a small phaeton and a pony to draw it, with a young man in livery and brass buttons to attend to her. On Sundays she was driven to church and swept majestically up and down the aisle of the Gardenmore church in the town, the young man tucking her feet in with a rug before beginning the return journey to her home. It was not only lawyers who were called names by her. Critics of her work were too. Amanda could not detect praise very well, even when it was given by book critics. In Jack Lowden's book are listed 50 names or phrases to describe those critics she didn't like. My favourites are half-starved upstarts, street Arabs, and drunken, ignorant dross. St. Scandal Bags was one, reserved for D.B. Wyndham Lewis. After her venture into running the lime kiln had been wound up, she used part of her home as shops for 6 years. One side of the ground floor was taken up with drapery, whilst the other side was a general grocery. But again, this venture wasn't the success she had hoped for. Apparently she hated commercial travellers calling in to collect bills. Later she sublet one side of the shop to a tenant, but because he insisted on opening on Sundays, which greatly offended Amanda's strict Sabbatarian views, they fell out. To give you some idea, Walter, of her persistence when thwarted, she hung outside the hall door, for she still lived on the premises, a banner on which was written, "All desecrators of the Sabbath will be punished." In addition, she opened the upstairs window of her house at 10 p.m. on Sunday nights and rang a loud brass handbell. However, in the end, she had to admit defeat. The shop was kept open by the tenant for as long as the law permitted. Andy Ross died in 1917, and there was the story about Amanda that she wore a white bridal gown at his funeral. This is probably apocryphal, but she did send back the number of wreaths which people who knew and liked Andy had provided. These folk apparently were not liked by her. One of the wreaths was from the railway company. A director was extremely ill. Let's call him Mr. X. She returned this wreath with the note, "Keep it for the funeral of Mr. X." In 1913 she published a set of 27 poems in a book entitled Poems of Puncture, in which she deliberately set out to wound those lawyers she didn't like. It has to be admitted that generally her efforts here are not of the highest literary quality, though they do give us insights into her personality which could be explosive and very confrontive. At Barry Payne's death, she wrote unflattering words about him. Yet for all of that, she had periods of calmness in herself. She was a good cook, was personally kind to those she liked, and had a keen dress sense, and was a handsome woman in her day. When finishing a letter, she always wrote, "Yours in calm and storm, A. Ross, author." Amanda never wrote for a popular market. Indeed, she appealed more to the intelligentsia. But during the 1914-18 war, under the pseudonym of Monica Moylan, she brought out a number of broadsheets which stirred the popular conscience, one of which, now it is said, is the rarest of all her works. It is called A Little Belgian Orphan. In 1922, on the 12th of June, in her own house, Amanda remarried her second husband. He was a farmer, Thomas Rogers, from Clint-Nagoolan, Ballynahinch. She went to live there, and like her marriage to Andy, this union was a very happy one. She had done little writing during the First World War, but had, as authors say, work in progress over a number of earlier years. These works, like one book entitled 6 Months in Hell, were never published. However, the Nonsuch Press in 1925 asked for permission to republish Irene Iddesleigh. Later, a further American edition came out, and Delina Delaney was subsequently published too by Chatto and Windus. Walter, it would be impossible to tell the story of Amanda without mentioning Mr. Thomas Mercer. Mr. Mercer was an authority on Amanda. He was a book collector from Thames Ditton in England, who started to correspond with her rather by accident in the 1920s. Mercer never met Amanda, yet for 10 years their friendship grew, and Jack Loudon says he knew more about her than anyone else, having a large collection of her unpublished letters. After her death, a small book called Bayonets of Bastard Sheen, containing extracts from these, was published by him. She told him many things about herself, including the fact that her works were most definitely her own, and contained, to quote her, not a borrowed stroke in one of them. She talked of the millions of readers who looked forward to reading every word she wrote, and was quite personal to him, speaking of her father and mother and her views on many subjects, including her strong dislike for Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, whose story she could not understand. Other people like John Coughlin, a Dubliner, and Norman Carruthers corresponded with her too in her later years. During the latter part of the 1920s, she resumed work on a novel she had left aside. This was Helen Huddleston, a tale set in and around Ballynahinch. Jack Loudon maintains that some of her best writing is contained in it. It concerns a young lady, Helen, who is carried off by a villainous lord, but is eventually rescued. Amanda never finished the book. It was left to Jack Loudon to edit it and supply the final chapter. For me, Walter, there are many genuinely amusing parts. The names of the main characters, for instance, are remarkable and funny, having the names of fruits and one vegetable. So we have Lord Raspberry, his sister Cherry Raspberry, the Earl of Grape, Madam Pear, Mrs. Strawberry, Mrs. Greengage, Sir Christopher Currant, and Lily Lentil. It is a story within a story. Amanda's last book, which was published in 1933, was Fumes of Formation. It is a book of verse containing 56 poems. Shortly afterwards, her second husband died, and she left the Ballynahinch area and returned to her house in Larne, where she lived for the remainder of her life, until her death on the 3rd of February 1939 at Iddesleigh. She had fractured her thigh in a fall in the house a few days previously. Walter, what is the key to Amanda's work? Jack Loudon posits that life in Larne for her was dull, so she gave full vent to her powerful imagination and created a fantasy world of her own where she mingled with lords and ladies. Also, it must be added, she had an extremely strong sense of family pride. One clue to this is that she said that her name McKitterick comes from a medieval Norse king's son Sihtric, written as Itteric. Also on occasion she styled herself Amanda Malvina Fitzallen Anne Margaret McClelland Ross. I feel that Amanda had a strong sense of her own importance. One of her critics, a Mr. Thomas Beer, in a review of Irene in the late 1920s, referred to the book in disparaging terms and called the author a poor tame woman, wife to a workman. When Amanda heard of this, her rage knew no bounds. Imagine the cheek of this upstart, she fumed. she who was very proud of Andy's standing in the community. Indeed, she had on occasions inflated his personal background to her friends. Notwithstanding all of this, I do feel her imagination to have been truly remarkable, considering she seldom listened to the radio, had never visited a theatre or read any literature of note. Certainly, whilst her writings are not fully to my taste in places, they are unforgettable. Anyone who could begin a poem on Easter with, "Dear Lord, the day of eggs is here," or speak of death as joining the battalions of the breathless, deserves to be remembered. The Belfast Central Library, in its Irish collection, holds an extensive amount of her work. Drummondess, Ballynahinch and Larne should be proud of her. She was truly rare. Perhaps everyone should read one of her books at least.
Enya's version of I Dreamt I Dwelt in Marble Halls, and before that, Jim O'Hagan recounting the story of Amanda McKitterick Ross. Well, it looks as if the Ulster Archaeological